The fog rolled over the city that morning, casting everything in a thick, ghostly haze. Detective Michael Rowan pulled his coat tightly around himself as he stepped out of his car and approached the towering glass condominium that loomed above the damp street. The building's sleek exterior reflected the dreary cityscape back at him, creating a distorted mirage of reality. He'd barely made it past the front door when Detective Clara Hughes caught up with him. Clutching a file and a steaming cup of coffee, she nodded a brief greeting, then fell into step beside him, her face unreadable. Ready for a complicated one? She asked, taking a sip of her coffee as they entered the lobby. We've got a dead socialite upstairs, and everyone's sure the husband did it, but he's got a solid alibi. Michael arched an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. High-profile cases had their challenges, but a locked-room mystery in a penthouse suite, that was something new. What kind of alibi? T asked. Clara flipped through her file as they stepped into the elevator. Security cameras caught him at a charity gala across town at the time of the murder. Multiple witnesses confirmed it, people he barely knows. Oh, it's unlikely he paid anyone off, and he hasn't exactly been subtle about his anger towards her. Sounds convenient, Michael muttered. What else? Patricia Kendall, age 47, real estate heiress, quite the figure in society circles. Clara explained, tapping a photo of a striking woman with platinum blonde hair and a cool, distant smile. A lot of enemies, most of them close friends, and a string of affairs that was practically an open secret. The elevator doors opened directly into the Kendall's penthouse, where a few uniformed officers were already processing the scene. A large open-planned room stretched before them, filled with modern art and cold, stylish furniture. Michael's eyes scanned the space, taking in every detail. Patricia lay sprawled on the thick white carpet, one arm outstretched, her fingers curled like she was reaching for something. Blood pooled around her head, staining the carpet dark red, while shards of glass from a shattered vase lay scattered across the floor. Michael approached the body carefully, crouching beside her. She looked peaceful, almost as if she were sleeping, but the violence of her injuries told a different story. His eyes moved to the broken vase, noting the sharp edges and the way it seemed to have exploded outward. Who found her? He asked, glancing up at Clara. Her assistant came by to drop off some papers early this morning, she replied, her voice tight. The husband, Richard Kendall, claims he hadn't been home since the night before. Michael straightened, frowning. Do we have footage of him leaving? That's where it gets complicated, Clara said, her tone shifting. Security footage shows him leaving just after 7 p.m. and arriving at the charity gala by 8. He was there the entire evening. We've got a solid timeline, but something doesn't add up. Why would someone so publicly hostile toward her even need an alibi? Michael scanned the room again, his gaze lingering on the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, which offered a stunning view of the city. A faint line of fingerprints on one of the panes caught his attention. He leaned in closer, narrowing his eyes. The smudges were inconsistent, as if someone had brushed their fingers against the glass in haste. Clara noticed his interest and joined him. What are you thinking? He shrugged, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. Maybe he found another way out. Let's dig deeper into the security footage, check if he accessed any other floors. People like Kendall don't like getting their hands dirty. If he's guilty, he might have had help. As they left the penthouse, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this case was different. Richard Kendall didn't seem like the type who would be easily satisfied with a single act of violence. There had to be more beneath the polished surface. Back at the precinct, Michael sat hunched over his desk, reviewing the security footage from the condo's hallway cameras. Hours passed as he watched Richard Kendall come and go, the man's movements crisp and controlled, as if he were always aware of being watched. But something caught his eye. At precisely 6:45 p.m. the previous evening, a figure dressed in a janitor's uniform had entered the private elevator, holding a large tool bag. Michael rewound the footage, watching it again and again, until he noticed a familiar glint in the figure's eye. Clara, he called out, his voice barely concealing his excitement. Look at this. Doesn't that janitor look familiar? Clara squinted at the footage, then her eyes widened. That's Richard, in a wig, but definitely him. He disguised himself. He went up there to set things up before leaving for the gala. That explains the glass he staged it, making it look like a spontaneous break-in. Michael nodded, the pieces finally coming together. Richard had created a scene that made it appear as though Patricia had been attacked after he'd left. The shattered vase, the fingerprints, everything was meant to suggest a violent intrusion. But the real kicker, Michael realized, lay in the weapon, or rather, the lack of one. Richard hadn't used a traditional weapon. The fragments of the vase were an attempt to mislead them, a clue pointing them down the wrong path. Hours later, they tracked Richard Kendall to his lawyer's office, where he sat, calm and collected, awaiting their arrival. His polished demeanor cracked slightly when he realized they'd found him out. "So, you were so desperate to be free of her," Michael began, "that you tried to create the perfect alibi, even using a gala as your cover." Richard's mouth twisted into a slight smile, but there was no humor in it. "Detective, you can't prove any of this. The security footage won't hold up in court, and you know it." Michael stepped closer, his voice low but sharp. "You thought you'd pull this off because you're untouchable, but I know men like you used to having power, using people. You'd do anything to get what you want. But we have enough to connect you to her murder, and we'll keep digging until the rest of your lies unravel." For the first time, Richard's calm demeanor wavered, his face paling as he glanced at his lawyer. Realizing he'd lost the game, he sighed, a hint of bitterness creeping into his voice. It was never supposed to come to this. She was impossible. Back at the precinct, Michael sat with Clara, reflecting on the case. The man had almost gotten away with it, not through brilliance, but through sheer arrogance. Clara noticed his pensive expression and gave him a nudge. "Thinking about the next one already?" Michael shook his head, looking weary. "Just thinking about what it does to people when they think they're invincible that you took him down," she said softly. "That counts for some things." Michael knew she was right, but the thought lingered. Cases like this where wealth and power were used as shields reminded him of just how easily people could justify their actions. He wondered how far someone like Richard Kendall could fall if the world had let him. But Michael also knew that, for now, he'd brought justice for Patricia, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to keep him going through the next case.